Welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, and it's a pleasure to host you here in our afternoon conversation on the 2024 presidential campaign and the future of American democracy. A few thank yous before we begin. First of all, to my staff, they've been working very hard, so thank you, the whole team, for all that you're doing. To the Lerman family, Thomas and Maura Lerman, they're not here with us today, but they came to me a few years ago and said, look, we need to make sure that we have conversations where students hear from the left and from the right. And that's certainly true. I'm proud to say that we can do that here at Notre Dame, and they're a supporter of our efforts, including of today's event. And then a special welcome to the Griffin family. Bob and Rich Griffin are two of my favorite people on this planet. A few years ago, these two gentlemen, they come to our events, and it's easy to see them, and they would ask questions, and they'd be around. And they came by my office a few years ago because they said they wanted to talk. And I was always happy to talk to alumni. So they came in, we sat down, and they grilled me for an hour. And they asked me all sorts of questions. How do you pick your students? How do you pick your subjects? I felt like I was in an interview, a very strenuous interview. And I thought these guys love their university so much that they sit down and quiz faculty on a Friday afternoon before a football game. So wonderful gentlemen. I really enjoyed the conversation. I remember leaving the conversation thinking, wow, what was that about? 2 weeks later, they came back and they said, we've been watching what you're doing. We love what you're doing. And we just want to say thank you for what you're doing. And they decided to support the program. Totally unexpected, a tremendous gift. There's a handful of individuals at this community that make what we do possible. And it really is just a handful of individuals. And Bob and Rich Griffin are two of those individuals. Tragically, Bob passed away earlier this year. He would have loved today's event. And so we have some of the members of the Griffin family with us today, and we miss Bob very much. And we're very extraordinarily thankful to the Griffin family and all of our supporters, especially Bob and Rich. Thank you very much. Two announcements. We're soon to go on fall break here on campus. Students have to do their midterms, then we go on fall break. When they come back for fall break, we have a couple big football games. Along with the big football games, the center has a couple of big events. On Friday, November 8th, that's the Friday before the Florida State game, the center will be hosting Governor Ron DeSantis here on campus. Public lecture at 4 p.m., and that's the Friday before the Florida State game. That's a ticketed event, so you'll need a ticket. There's a handful of people in the room who can get you a ticket. So you want to find one of those people and get a ticket if you want a ticket. Then the following Saturday, we host Virginia. The following Friday, the center will be hosting an economist and a scientist, Jay Bhattacharya. That name may mean something to you. He was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. He's going to come speak on free speech and how a culture of free speech is necessary for science. That's going to be a phenomenal event, both those events. So Governor DeSantis on the Friday before Florida State, and then Jay Bhattacharya the Friday before the Virginia game. Let me say one word about our format today, and then we'll properly introduce our guests. My original idea was to have a Lincoln Douglas debate between these two gentlemen on the Trump prosecutions. But then there was more Trump prosecutions, and there was a conviction, then a Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, and then Trump was shot, and then Biden was deposed, and that all happened in 6 weeks. And first we're going to debate the Trump prosecutions, and then we need to talk about the Supreme Court opinion. And so the subject for the debate was changing every week. So finally, I just said to them, just come out in October and we'll figure out what we're going to talk about when you get here. So we're going to have a moderated conversation of 3 or 4 rounds, and I'll ask some questions, but it's really to have them speak. We have a tradition here at the center, which we want to follow, and that's one of our students. So Lila, right? Lila, who's your senior? Senior, majoring in sociology and Spanish, minoring in constitutional studies, I take it? Minoring in constitutional studies will introduce our speakers.
Harry Littman is the senior legal affairs columnist for the opinion page of the Los Angeles Times, the creator and host of the Talking Feds podcast, and a regular commentator on MSNBC, CNN, and CBS News. Mr. Littman also teaches constitutional and national security law at UCLA and UC San Diego. Previously, he has served as a U.S. Attorney and Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and was a law clerk to Supreme Court Justices Thurgood Marshall and Anthony Kennedy. John Yoo is the Emmanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is also a regular commentator on Fox News. Professor Yu has previously served in all three branches of the federal government. He was an official in the U.S. Department of Justice during the George W. Bush administration, where he worked on national security and terrorism after 9/11. He has also served as general counsel of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and was a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and federal appeals judge Lauren Silverman. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Our first topic is the Trump prosecutions, or the prosecutions of Trump. 4 cases, 2 state cases, 2 federal cases. The New York case, and that led to a conviction on fraudulent business findings. The racketeering case out of Georgia, and then 2 federal cases brought by the special prosecutor, one involving classified documents, and then one involving January 6th. Professor Yu, if I can start with you, are these prosecutions a way to uphold our democracy and the rule of law? Do they threaten democracy? How should we think about these prosecutions from your point of view?
First, thank you, Phil, for inviting us and for the warm welcome. It's great to be here with my friend Harry. Known each other almost 30 years now, I think. It's just a joke is my office is actually right next to the football stadium. And when I was a young professor, I would go to work on Saturdays to try to get tenure. And the football game would be on at the same time. And it wasn't until my 5th or 6th year on the faculty that I found out that they shot a cannon when they would score a touchdown. I didn't know that for a few years. So I have to say, I think that prosecutions have been a disaster. If you thought that the purpose was to get someone who you did not believe was fit for the office of the president out of the race, the prosecutions have completely boomeranged. You have Ron DeSantis coming in a few months. Go back and look at the polls in December of 2023. In December 2023, Ron DeSantis was ahead of Donald Trump in the polls. If you wanted to get Donald Trump out of the race, which I think was the purpose of the prosecutions, certainly in New York and Georgia, and I do think, unfortunately, as a Justice Department, the prosecutions guaranteed Trump winning the primary. Every day that Trump was in court, every day that there was some development in the trials, sucked all the oxygen out of the primary race and drew all the attention onto Trump. For good or ill, there was a rally around the flag in the Republican Party around Donald Trump in response to these prosecutions. So I think even if you were a Democrat and you wanted Trump out of the race, this was the worst way to do it because you actually when DeSantis is here, ask him why he didn't when he has already said that he thought he lost because he could not break through all the media coverage of Trump's trials. He never had a chance. Does anybody know Ron DeSantis's economic platform in the primaries? No, he never had a chance to make his case because everyone in the Republican Party was focused every day on all these. I have to say, it also made Trump finally a disciplined candidate. I wish he was under prosecution more often because he could only talk for 5 minutes. Every time he came out of the courtroom, he gave really direct, sharp, to the point comments, and then he shut up and went back to Trump Tower. And he had great success in the primary campaigns because of the trials, ironically. I think they did not even achieve their purpose. They actually had the unintended consequence of producing the exact opposite result. Second, for several of the prosecutions, I think the utter weakness of the charges that were brought undermine the idea of neutral prosecution. That's the only one I think would ever be worthy of bringing against a former president. The case in New York is a joke. And I think a lot of commentators on the left are embarrassed. That case went to trial, and that's the one that produced the conviction. I think I fully expect that to be reversed on appeal after the Supreme Court's immunity case. But the idea that these hush money payments were turned into a felony because they allegedly interfered with an election and broke federal election law, which is federal law up to federal prosecutors to bring, could produce a felony. And you get a conviction on that using testimony by White House officials to procure the conviction. I think the tenuousness of those claims and the weakness of the facts there and the way the case was tried underscore how political the prosecution was. Then you have the Atlanta prosecution where The DA there is charging the entire Trump campaign with being a racketeering and corrupt enterprise like a mafia or drug cartel. It's accusing a First Amendment enterprise as being a criminal enterprise for the first time in our history. That prosecution is so flawed. The DA appointed her boyfriend to be the special counsel, right? So when I was watching the day-to-day news on this, I can't help thinking they should have a new show called The Real Prosecutors of Atlanta. What is going on in this kind of DA's office where these kind of shenanigans are going on when you have arguably the most important prosecution you could ever bring in American history, which you're claiming a former president of trying to overthrow the government? That disgraced that office too. I don't want to talk too much about the classified information trial because I think that one has just been so forestalled. The real test of this is a January 6th prosecution. When Harry and I would debate this on TV, I was like, if you're ever going to prosecute a former president, and we never have, but if you were going to do it, it would be for something like January 6th. I expected a lot more of the special counsel because when I looked at the charges, he did not charge Trump with insurrection. He didn't charge Trump with sedition, which are crimes. He charged Trump with fraud, like he was overcharging the US government for wrenches and hammers like defense contractors. He charged Trump with trying to interfere with a congressional investigation, which was not going on. And then he claimed that Trump had deprived every American in the country of their voting rights. I don't know if you felt that happen back in last November, but everyone, whether they voted for Trump or didn't vote for Trump, had their voting rights unconstitutionally violated by Donald Trump. The charges just don't fit the kinds of allegations that are being made. That's why I worry about this, because I think it has really reduced the faith of half the country, I would say, in the neutrality and partiality of our system of justice. The only way our system of justice works is if we have voluntary belief in it and compliance with it. We're a country that doesn't have a lot of police officers. We don't have a lot of prosecutors. Most Americans follow the law voluntarily. That's what makes us different than Europe. We all follow the law because we have faith in the integrity of the justice system. And then when you see it being used in this way, where the charges and the way they're brought are so far apart from what I think should be the way a case like this would have been done, it makes you question whether it was all political in the first place. And that ultimately harms all of us, and it harms the justice system. That's the first time anyone has ever applauded when I've said this, but that's because I teach at Berkeley.
I also want to say thank you for having me. It's an honor, but also a pleasure to be at a place that I think maybe more than any in the United States is dedicated to values of faith, but also combined with intellectual rigor. Thanks for the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, which I think is really making a name for itself around the country. To you, Phil, to Dawn, to Anna Bradley, and of course to John, who I think I've debated 20 times on Fox or so, never on MSNBC. We should maybe check. The main thing is I think your answer, assumed the question, which is, were these in fact done for the purpose of pushing Trump out of office? Were they, in fact, as you put it, not neutral and impartial? The rule of law, which is what the question is about, means or implies that laws and people will govern, and therefore law will be applied without fear or favor. You don't want to single out Trump, as I think you've assumed but haven't really addressed, for prosecutorial treatment, nor do you want to insulate him. That's the notion anyway. Maybe there's a special principle. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is an empirical question in the first instance, and the empirical question is, given the conduct at issue in the 4 cases, would charges have been brought against any generic person? And it can be a hard counterfactual, but I think here not really. I was really surprised to hear you, John, minimize or trivialize the Mar-a-Lago case. It's true that it's hit a lot of roadblocks, but the actual conduct, there's no conduct remotely close to what Trump did as a private citizen, for starters, but number of documents he took, their sensitivity, their potential for harm, his obstruction, resisting giving them back. There's not a pattern of facts anywhere close. You think of maybe Sandy Berger stuffing one piece of paper in his shirt that would not have resulted in prosecution, and for good reason. So if the initial test is of the rule of law, is this something that would have been brought anyway? It's really a no-brainer. And you have the additional point of it doesn't really concern anything about the presidency. It's his squiring them away after. January 6th, I agree, the very big test. Harder to say about what had been brought because it's so sui generis, but you do have 1,000 people who the Department of Justice has prosecuted. They have been largely upheld. I think whatever your view of the Trump or the events, it's an extraordinarily grave thing that happened January 6th, and the notion of a pass to, after all, when you, as a prosecutor, when you prosecute foot soldiers, you want to go after the general. There's a lot of very strong proof, including that came out last week, that Trump was the general. It would be, I think, extraordinary not to bring that case. Actually, I want to do one quick asterisk, which is in a different kind of world, like the Nixon-Ford world, you could actually see philosopher kings deciding, you know what we should do here? We should just get him out, just be done with him, not prosecute, et cetera. But the very effort to keep this so on the straight and narrow and not change the rubric made that kind of thing impossible, made it necessary to go with a general, normal prosecution with Biden hands off, et cetera. The state cases, I agree there's an inherent worry there. What if the West Texas DA now indicts Biden? Of course, again, that assumes the question of, would they normally? I attended the New York trial. It is not a righteous trial. I agree it's somewhat picayune, but the charges are picayune and would result in a very short sentence. And I can tell you this, there are scores of cases that they were able to point to where those charges were brought. It's hard to say if they would have been because we don't know the counterfactuals there of when prosecutors turned down those cases. But at least I don't see the overwhelming evidence of this first empirical question, which I think goes to what John has assumed, which is this being done to get him out. Fulton County, a total mess for reasons having little to do with the merits, poorly charged, not going to come back, I think. And I think for purposes of this discussion, we should set it to the side. But certainly these two federal cases, if they were not to be brought, I think you'd really have to question whether we are a government of laws and not of persons. They are really serious offenses. And for the president to have gotten a walk based on them, I think would have been unsettling. John has a minute to respond, though.
Let me ask a follow-up on both, and I'll start with you, John, and then go to Professor Lippman. It's interesting, Professor, you viewed the cases in a political sense. It was bad politics if you wanted to get at Trump. Whereas Professor Lippman viewed the cases in a legal sense. Professor Lippman's point is, look, the rule of law requires that we go after lawbreakers. Trump was a lawbreaker, therefore the rule of law requires. If we don't go after the president, then we really don't have the rule of law. How do you respond to that, John?
I wouldn't say political like Republican, Democrat, but political in the sense of constitutional politics, of which your center is one of the places to study, which is the combination of the Constitution, politics, and the law. We have never prosecuted a former president in the history of the country. And it's not because our former presidents were all angels. Andrew Jackson probably killed someone in a duel, right? I mean, LBJ went into politics, a poor teacher, and came out a multimillionaire, right? Presidents, I'm not saying presidents. Anyway. I'm not saying presidents have been given over time, I wouldn't say a pass, but what we've required is some kind of heightened standard to prosecute them. It's not because of the rule of law not working. It's because there are other political values at stake. And the political value at stake is we also want to have an energetic presidency. And so one thing we've always been worried about in our system is if you subjected a president to legal liability for decisions they make in office, we worry that presidents are going to be cautious. They're going to be risk averse. They're going to be like claims adjusters at insurance companies, right? Calculating everything, the actuarial tables when they make decisions, when the whole purpose of the Constitution creating a president is to create a single person who can act with, and this is Alexander's phrase from the Federalist Papers, energy, decision, speed. So this is not something I made up about Trump. This is something that comes from the very founding. The Supreme Court has long recognized that's why presidents get executive privilege, when it's not in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says presidents get to discuss things in secret with their advisors. But the Supreme Court in a Nixon case said, even though we don't like Nixon and what he was doing, we still have to protect his discussions with his aides with confidentiality to make sure the presidency can function in the future. So that's my point, is that, yes, we have the rule of law, But to make sure that we have a system that functions effectively, we do require a heightened standard before you go after a former president or a Supreme Court justice or a member of Congress. Right? We don't just treat them, okay, you broke the law, we're going to prosecute you just like everybody else, because there are other values at stake. So my point is, if you are going to go after a president, then it should be something really important. And so that's why I can see January 6th meets that standard. But that's why I don't think that prosecution was done in the right way. I think Jack Smith completely screwed the case up. He's produced no real new facts that we didn't know before from congressional hearings. To me, the political system would say, you want to have a referendum on Trump? We're going to have one in a month. If you think he's responsible for January 6th, don't vote him into office.
One sentence and one quick factual rebuttal. I don't think that's right. The 160-page brief from last week has a lot of stuff because people went to the grand jury, like Mike Pence and others. There are really new, pretty startling things. On your point, John, I just want to say, okay, and it's a good segue because we're going to talk immunity, but that's an overlay. This initial question, is it bad for the rule of law? And if the rule of law means, as I've suggested in encapsulated form, is with application without fear or favor, I hold to my view. And now we can consider whether there's special reasons for the president.
I think, Professor Yu, ironically, when you're looking left, we can hear you better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe a follow-up to you, Professor Lippman.
Yeah.
Professor Yu said, look, the prosecutions didn't work in their political sense, meaning that they helped Trump in the campaign. Do you just agree with that as a matter of
empirically?
Yeah.
But I'm a prosecutor. I don't think that should have been a lookout of the prosecutorial system, but I think it's true. I take DeSantis's point. He had a sort of fatal absence of charisma and other things. But yeah, and there was this interesting phenomenon that happened again last week. This big brief comes out. There's all these revelations. And it seems already baked in his sort of vicious conduct. So I don't disagree with that. I just think it's not the rule of law question.
Our second subject is the Trump versus United States. This was the decision in late June, early July 2024 on presidential immunity. I'll start with you, Professor Lippman. Did the Supreme Court get it right? The Supreme Court ruled that the core functions of the presidency are immune from criminal prosecution, absolute immunity. Now, non-core functions, there seems to be possibly immune. Maybe you can explain your understanding of what the case said. It's a very long case.
Yeah.
And then, more importantly, should the president, at least in some of his core functions or very core functions, be immune from criminal prosecution?
So very briefly, that's right. After a district court said no, that the principle that I just stated applies, and a bipartisan court of appeals unanimously held otherwise. The Supreme Court said no for pretty much the reasons John said, the need for nimbleness and aggressiveness and the like. They perceived an immunity principle. And just to flesh out very briefly what Don is saying, when there are certain core powers, and those seem to be more or less constitutionally enumerated powers, hands off totally. And if there are so much of what the president does is official, even if not ensconced in constitutional terms, those are presumptively barred from prosecution, but that presumption can be overturned, although that part of the opinion, I think, is especially cryptic. So let me just say, and the question was, is it good for rule of law and democracy? Because I see those as two different questions. First thing I want to say is this is not a plebiscite, I agree, but 70% of Americans, including the majority of Republicans, favor a constitutional amendment stating that no person, including the president, is above the law. There really is something fundamentally chafing about the decision. There's a principle we're all grow up with from nursery school that no person is above the law, the felt sense that the opinion makes the president a king, exactly what the American experiment was constituted to reject. So I do think there's this very strong popular sense of a wrong turn that goes to the DNA of the country. Okay, but Supreme Court's out there for counter-majoritarian reasons. Some of its finest moments have been when it's gone against the rules. So what about that? And I want to speak to the opinion briefly. First, they call this a separation of powers. I mean, you've read about in the paper, separation of powers. I first want to point out what an odd separation of powers kind of analysis it is. This is not your Scalia analysis where one house veto or executive power given to someone not under the executive. It really, I think, and it's consistent. I'm not saying John has said this, but it's consistent with what he said so far, is the driver here is not text, but the majority's own sense, a kind of personal civics about the need for a president to be nimble and aggressive. Maybe the president will stay his hand because of the risk of criminal prosecution. First thing I want to say, again, that's an empirical question. First time in the history of the country that anyone's brought a criminal case against the president. Seems pretty clear to me presidents have been aware of that prospect. Nixon certainly was, and wanting to have a pardon. And I think it's equally plausible that presidents have known it's possible, but criminal stuff as opposed to civil is so far outside the bounds. So I think of it as an empirical claim, and a pretty weak empirical claim. And when you put it up against the conduct we're talking about, to be sure that the court says we're writing for the ages, et cetera, another kind of strange claim when it's the only time it's happened in history. But I just don't think that the kind of conduct he's been charged with is the sort of thing that a nimble and aggressive president would say, I really want for good executive power to take all these documents or to foment an insurrection, but I better not. That's just not within the pale and that's definition of criminal law. And it does, as John has just said, it's had this very corrosive effect on people's confidence in the rule of law, in the justice system overall. So my main point here is there's a good reason that so many people balk at it, and the counterpoints by the court are not separation of powers in the way we think of them, but really completely contingent, questionable claims about what makes for a nimble and aggressive president. And when you're talking about crimes, is it tenable that a president will want to be going there legitimately in ways you'd want to encourage and would be salutary, and then say, oh, maybe they will. It's a hard hypothetical to draw, I think. Here's something, oh, he wants to obstruct. He wants to. Now, I think we're going to hear, understandably, in today's polarized environment, you can make a crime of something, et cetera. That goes back to the initial position of the rule of law. But the idea that you need this principle to, not for, does anyone even know what the separation of powers violation was? It's a serious question. Here's what it was. Congress passing laws of general applicability. That's the separation of powers problem, is that Congress passed laws and didn't say, the action here is intra-executive branch, right? DOJ going against the former president. But they have to say to dress it up in separation of powers language that Congress did something wrong by not exempting the president. So I think it's been too easily accepted as bedrock constitutional law. And I think what lies behind it is basically civics and disputable, even weak civics.
So I think this is another example of liberals doing things with unintended consequences, because I think I don't dispute that people who work at Justice or the Biden White House, they decided to prosecute Trump in good faith. They think he's a threat to democracy. They think he did try to overthrow the government. I don't think the charges that Jack Smith lined up actually fit with those kinds of accusations. They're strange run-of-the-mill white-collar crimes, actually. This is another example. One other unintended consequence that these prosecutions, again, the first time in American history produced, was a reaction by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices, I think, and this is not the legal analysis, this is more the political constitution analysis, looked out and saw the incredible disorder going on with 4 prosecutions going at the same time, not just against the former president, but the leading opposition candidate for the presidency. And they saw lawfare going on in this way that could open up the door in the future to West Texas DAs prosecuting Kamala Harris, right? It doesn't have to be Joe Biden. It could be someone actually running for the presidency. And so I think what the Supreme Court has tried to do is to put an end to it. Because I actually agree with much of what Harry says. The opinion, I thought beforehand, was not going to hold for presidential immunity, because if you really were, as this court says it is, trying to honor the original understanding of the Constitution, the founders pretty clearly said you could prosecute former presidents. Alexander Hamilton said it several times during the founding. But what the court did instead was said, we're actually going to import these contemporary concerns we have about the working of the presidency, about the need for energy in the executive, about the need to protect the decision-making freedom of a president from the worry of being prosecuted someday in the future. I think the prosecutions were so extraordinary that the court responded in this extraordinary fashion too. I just want to underscore that the Constitution already has mechanisms for this. And that's why we had never prosecuted people before. We have impeachment in the Constitution for a reason. Trump was impeached for January 6th. I don't know why the House took its time in not reporting out the charges. I don't know why the Senate decided to hold the trial once Trump was out of office. They didn't have to, but that's a mechanism in the Constitution to punish a president for the claims that are being made against him now. We also have the electoral system. Again, people think Trump is responsible for January 6th. They think Trump took too many classified documents with him and didn't secure them at his house. That's the way we had traditionally handled things. Yes, this immunity decision is a big distortion in our constitutional law, but so is prosecuting former presidents with the criminal law for things that our Constitution had created its own special process for impeachment and the electoral process. That explains to me why the immunity decision is so remarkable, because I agree, it does stick out from the rest of the constitutional as this unbelievable act by the court.
So you're both agreed on the merits of the legal analysis, or the legal decision in the court, that Justice Roberts' majority opinion, 6-3, if memory serves me right. Both of you find it that legally unpersuasive.
And there's a concurrence as to one aspect, an important aspect about evidence, which may come to the fore again with Justice Barrett. But yeah, and to be fair, I heard John explain it, that I'm not sure he's as opposed to it as I, but yeah, I think we were both pretty critical of it is supposed to be a legal, part of what's going on in the whole thing, and I agree, is these are inherently political events that it's an imperfect fit to graft the legal system on. Nevertheless, if the answer, as I was saying before, we've abandoned the possibility of a non-legal answer. That might have been a mistake way back when, but really this is where we are in terms of trying to address things. Yeah.
Professor,
I don't want to say one. No, I'm sorry. You go ahead. It's not. Yeah.
Professor, one follow-up question. You mentioned Hamilton. So the originalist opinion, you're a noted originalist. The originalist opinion in the case is by Justice Sotomayor, not by Chief Justice Roberts. Is the most decisive piece of originalist evidence Federalist 69?
Yeah. Your professor has read the Federalist Papers. This doesn't happen at most universities these days. So kudos to you. I actually think the best opinion is actually Justice Barrett's opinion, who I hear had a pretty good legal education. I have to confess, I met her as a Notre Dame law student because we both clerked for the same lower court judge, Larry Silberman. And so I got to know her when she was just a law student who'd just been hired by Judge Silberman.
Another thing we can
and
agree
I said,
on, Judge
she's
Silberman died this year. He was a titan of American law.
I even said that she's going to be on the Supreme Court, but I didn't say which country. Look, I think she got it right, which was to say the founders they didn't even think about immunity. And they did talk about prosecuting former presidents because the anti-federalists said, you've created a monarchy in this president. And in England, the monarch can't be prosecuted. And so Hamilton in 69 says, no, if a president really committed a crime, you could impeach him, remove him from office, and then prosecute him. I mean, he says that pretty clearly. Nobody says, oh, no, that's not right. Hamilton got it wrong. But there's a difference between being immune and then once you're charged, President Trump could have said, the things I did were constitutional. And if they're constitutional, I can't be prosecuted for them because it's part of my executive authority. It would in the end be similar to the analysis, but it wouldn't be the idea of a president is just not subject to the rule of law at all, which is what immunity actually means. Immunity means a court cannot legally hear a prosecution involving a president. That's much more sweeping than President Obama is the hypothetical I would raise is President Obama saying, yeah, I launched a drone in order to shoot a missile and kill an American. This is all true, who was working for Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So President Obama killed an American citizen by remote drone. Even if he were to be prosecuted by President Trump's Justice Department for murder, it's a generally applicable federal murder law. He could have said, it's my constitutional defense that I was acting as commander in chief to protect the country. That's not immunity, but that's president just saying on the merits, I can't be tried for that. I had a higher source of law that I was acting under.
Again, 2 quick points, factual and legal. So the factual one, fair enough, but this is everyone out who has read Locke or whatever. It's a question of an executive prerogative. Lincoln did it as well. Should there be some extra legal action? And if you but this is a very kind of special realm in foreign policy. The main thing I want to say is just to bring up to everyone, we've now said, and I agree with Professor Yu, that the Supreme Court was motivated by its own sense of the politics and going back and forth and putting an end to it. But they're a court who had to write in terms of constitutional law. I encourage everyone to just ask themselves, is this the right role for a Supreme Court of the United States to be playing, to take it upon themselves to make this kind of resolution and vindication of where the values should be because they perceive other members of the government to have failed?
But Harry, that bolsters your point, because you said earlier, maybe what we went wrong is that, we made this too legal because the court had to say something.
But that's still their job. That's right. Yeah.
No, but prosecution asks for the blessing of the court, right? You can't prosecute and convict someone unless a judge has a trial and finds a verdict. It requires judicial approval. So that's what I'm faulting the Biden administration for, is pulling the courts and the legal system into trying to address what's fundamentally a political problem.
And I'll just say, I don't think it's uniquely with the Biden administration, but nevertheless, to the extent it's a problem, we can see because of our polarization, we were just unable politically. We had a failure of institutions to be able to bring some kind of consensus choice or wise solution to what is largely, at least, a political problem. I take the questions to be evaluating the prosecutions on their own terms, and that's a really important thing to do as a former prosecutor. But I also take your point, and it's just because everyone on both sides wanted to say, we're not doing anything political, putting our thumbs on the scale. What was left? Not just Biden, not even Garland, basically. Jack Smith, just a guy who is really deciding for the country how to handle. That's a flaw, but it doesn't go to rule of law. It's not a flaw of the rule of law.
It's an indictment of the Biden administration, though.
It's an indictment of the last 30 years of American government.
I hate to say this because I think we have had a president who's not really been in command. And I think a sensible president and a sensible attorney general who were in command would have considered all of these issues. Yes, there are professional prosecutors who will say, okay, here are 100 things that have been done.
George W. Bush did it for Scooter Libby.
No,
right?
that's what I'm saying.
That's what I'm saying. It's more than.
But Biden didn't. What he did is he let Jack Smith just run rampant with no real constraint or control.
Jack Smith played the legal role Jack Smith is supposed to play, but it was already, by the time Smith was appointed, we were past the point of a broader Nixonian solution.
But you know that prosecution is not just this robotic enterprise with right or wrong answers. There is a very strong policy component. Is this prosecution in the best interests of the country? Right? When you were U.S. Attorney in Pittsburgh, you measured every choice, I hope, by that standard.
Maybe a little.
Best interests of Pittsburgh, which are sometimes more important.
Right.
But you're right, yes. But the main point is every prosecution has this component to it. And the president and the attorney general are unwilling to exercise their role to make sure that the prosecutions of Trump fit with the national interest rather than using a more political avenue. And so they let this guy go wild. And yes, he might have done what a career prosecutor would do, but without any sensitivity to the broader constitutional issues at stake. And that's why it's so screwed up. And that's why the Supreme Court had to respond in this way.
Smith is subject to pretty strong oversight by the deputy. But I just want to say what you're clearly suggesting is Biden on the first week, as Ford did when he said our national nightmare is over, should have come out and said, I've thought this over. You've elected me. And in my wisdom, I've decided here's what we should do about Trump. We've got a nice island picked out for him in Macedonia. He won't bother us anymore. And that would have been clearly political suicide and illegitimate in our
What
system.
if Biden had pardoned Trump?
Trump didn't
prosecute Hillary, even though he kept saying lock her up.
Oh, who's applauding here? You guys believe Hillary violated the law with her emails? Wow, I'm in a rough crowd. Okay, let's just go. All right.
I was getting nervous about the amount of agreement. Let's talk about the 2024 campaign, and I guess the candidates too. The campaign has been unlike anything we've seen. We've had 2 assassination attempts, and then the removal of a candidate against his will, or maybe partially against his will. It's a little hard to know. What does this campaign itself and all the events of it threaten our democratic processes? And then we can save this one for the last round. But there's a big question here, which we need to get to. Is Donald Trump a unique threat to democracy? Let's start with the campaign first, and we'll talk about that. Then we can go to Trump. John, you want to go first on this one?
We had a wonderful session with the students right before over lunch, and one of them asked that. And I said, one, we're not a democracy. We're a republic. And we don't have a system that's designed for 51% of the country to just run everything. We actually have a constitution that tries to contain and balance democracy. That's why we have a Senate, right? Why does Indiana get 2 senators and California gets 2 senators? I'm not sure who my senators even are. And I think I know who the Indiana senators are better than the California ones because they have way more power in the Senate per person. So our Constitution has a judicial review, which Harry was just saying has produced some of the great decisions in our country's history. Right? Because the Thurgood Marshall in many respects. That's really an anti-democratic system. So our Constitution has very important anti-democratic features. I actually think of Trump as actually representing more of a democratic force in our politics than what our country. No, Trump is someone who the party doesn't want to be the nominee, right? The Republican establishment, of which I'm a card carrying. I'm the last neocon around, guys. Believe me, I still want to spread democracy in the world. It seems like such a quaint concept, but the Republican establishment doesn't want Trump to be president. He represents a populist uprising against the Republican establishment and against the way government is done. That's his appeal. He's a populist, right? Jackson or William Jennings Bryan. Those are the people he reminds me the most of. You can almost see what's happening to Trump is like the system responding to this excessive democracy in a way. I think what you actually see in an anti-democratic way is Biden's replacement by Harris. That's done without any vote by party insiders who are not, many of them not elected, many of them donors, right? And they, for purposes of winning the election, without anybody ever voting on it, swap in one candidate with another. And it's not been good for the Democratic Party. I would say that a lot of the things people are unsatisfied with the Harris nomination is because she hasn't been tested. She didn't have to go through a primary, answer all these questions, mix it up and debate with other contenders, which I think would have been good for her and for the Democratic Party, but also good for if you really want to have more democracy in the system. So I'm ambivalent about democracy, pure democracy. I actually quite like our system that is a mixed, what we call mixed regime. It has elements of all different kinds of government. But it does seem to me that all these anti-Trump efforts are a response by bureaucracy and by, I don't call it a deep state, it's just bureaucracy and the established parties against this kind of insurgent democratic force that Trump represents.
So these are really specific, but let me just start quickly on the counter-majoritarian idea, which we were talking about at lunch. In other countries, England's a very good example, have gone more and more, have dispensed with their counter-majoritarian institutional features. And it's actually remarkable that unlike certain really bedrock values that everyone agreed with, things like the Electoral College or contingent political events or compromises, I understand very much, like many here I'm sure are studying Plato and ambivalence about democracy. I do think these counter-majoritarian structures are meant to be push a little at the margins, and we're in an unusual and troublesome time. Only by virtue, say, of the Electoral College can one party for many years consecutive. I think in the long run, in a democracy, we think the majority should prevail, but that's a much bigger topic. Let me just say as to these first, I don't see the big deal with the substitution of Biden. No rules or anything were broken. It's true that it would normally be a more participatory process, but we have, from the beginning, each party putting forward however the party decides to choose who they think is most likely to win. I can see maybe a value to democracy if they'd fought it out and Shapiro had emerged in October, but it wouldn't have been more likely to produce what they want, which is the candidate to beat Trump, and that they decided to do that and swapped out for pretty good reason. It doesn't seem to me any kind of deep ethical issue. Yes, I've always, my whole career, I've thought of myself as a rule of law Democrat, but a neutral values guy, et cetera. It does seem to me that he is a unique or damn near unique threat to American democracy. I think we should take him at his word that if he's elected, he'll hollow out DOJ and make its operating principle be loyalty to him. He'll think of the government as a tool for self-enrichment. He'll undermine NATO and our allies and be disastrous in foreign policy. He's indifferent about democratic norms. And then, maybe we'll come to this a little more, but we've become inured to it, but lies, and they damage our democracy. We don't even have the ability to agree on facts that would seem to be just a default necessity to be able to govern and decide things. Some of them are really damaging. What he said this last week about Helene, 33 bomb threats then ensue. It's much worse than that. And I think we were talking about this at lunch. There's some tradition of fibbing, confabulating, obfuscating. But man, this guy wakes up lying and lies all day about things that are really consequential. I think that's a pernicious, if not unique, threat in American history.
In the law school, we're the experts on truth. So interested in what the experts on liars, which are political scientists.
Trump on democracy. Do you think he's a unique threat to democracy?
I have to say, I don't think he's a unique threat to democracy. I think our democracy handled him. If you think he is this threat, he was removed from office. He has said, even if he says all these things that you say he says, he's running for office.
Come on, we can agree that he said them.
But I'm not saying he's telling the truth in any of these things.
Okay.
I'm just saying politicians lie. We have a system where we elect people, and we're the voters. We get to decide whether we think it's worth it to have them in office, even if they say things which aren't true. I mean, Kamala Harris, the week after that debate, came out and said, "Oh, Joe Biden's doing a competent job in office." Are you going to say she's lying or not? No, I'm not going to call her a liar because she said something which was not consistent with the facts.
But are you really implying that, that Trump is different and just degree not kind?
No, I don't think hold on, I'm not, man, no.
Not all politicians lie.
I didn't say that. No, I said politicians tell lies. I didn't say all. I didn't say all.
Tell lies. I worked for Senator Leahy. I knew John Podesta. Please, I am not your standard interrupter to the situation. I grew up in a Republican family. Dad handled 24 Republican campaigns.
Ma'am, you need to settle down so everybody in the audience can hear what we're saying. And then I'm sure you're going to have time to ask a question. I'm not, ma'am. Then ma'am, I think you're getting way.
This is Don's job. This is Don's job.
This reminds me of Berkeley, actually, but you're getting way too upset.
From Yale University, serving everybody. I will not be quiet. Lies are God bless you all. I knew Father Esper. I know he furniture. We're all Americans first. It is the rule of law.
All right, John, here, let's get back to the question of the rule of Trump and democracy.
My point was just, I don't think he's a unique threat to democracy, which justifies crossing some constitutional Rubicons like prosecuting a former president or prosecuting the main opposition candidate for president. I think we have a system that handles someone if you think he really is that threat. We have tools like impeachment. We have tools like elections, and I think they've been adequate. I think there is this fear of him because of his rhetoric that exaggerates him into this kind of threat to democracy. I think our system has functioned pretty damn well for 230 years. We've had all kinds of colorful characters who run for president, like Andrew Jackson, like William Jennings Bryan, like have said incredible things and have done incredible things, which the political establishments of those times thought, how can we let this guy be president? But still, we had a system that survived it and handled it. I don't think Trump is unique in any kind of threat to democracy.
No, I got to answer that one.
Please.
Wait, my interrupter is getting ready for you. Hold on.
Okay. First, on this point of impeachment, really interesting, but I think the framers envisioned a system, not a two-party system, a system of factions. The last many years have shown that it's essentially a constitutionally impotent mechanism. If there's going to be two parties, there are like 7 or 8 Republicans crossed over to get to 67. The Republicans actually wanted to impeach him, but the rule of party trumped. Second, you said 2 things, that and elections. Of course, what we're now talking about is how serious and important is this vote. I know there are a lot of people in this room and around the country who hold particular principles really dear. Might be one-issue voters. Maybe it's right to life. Maybe it's guns. Maybe it's Israel. And my whole feeling here is that this is a unique election where those just really need to give ground, because we are talking about democracies do wither. We're an amazing kind of success story. But you look around the world in the last 30 years, it's not like military coup. It's autocratic rulers and erosion of norms, and that parchment barriers can't hold. And sure, it's an empirical question, but man, when you look at what Trump has promised to do, when you look at what he'll need to do with the Republican Party, I think there's a really strong chance that there's never been in my lifetime, and as you pointed out, I am old, that if he's elected, will look a lot like Hungary or Turkey or whatever. We're going to have a question and answer period. How could it be? How could it be? Listen to what he said and listen to his will, to his absolute brazenness and complete indifference to what have been, even with a Jackson, even with a McCarthy, even with a Williams Jennings Bryan, have been actual impediments and deterrences and disincentives. He pays attention to 0 of them. So I think that more fundamental things than individual issues are at stake.
Can I follow
please.
up on that?
Yeah,
Daniel?
of course.
If Trump wins, and
Yeah.
certainly it's no means clear that he will, but if he wins,
Yeah.
he'll be a lame duck on day one.
The worst.
You articulated fears about what he might do. But given his unique status, lost, then came back and won again, what might we expect in a Trump presidency? You have any predictions on that? It sounds like you're worried about the worst things happening.
Well, you said so. On day one, I think that the DOJ which is a really important, the rule of law. And I'm sorry, you should go first on this. I don't mean to.
Oh, I thought you were.
Yeah, I think we'll hollow out I think we'll make the federal government. There's a more interesting intellectual argument about the administrative state and where the court's going. But in general, the people who serve Trump will be chosen based on loyalty. I think it's disaster for foreign policy. I think it's a great day for Putin, a terrible one for Ukraine, and therefore bad for NATO. But all those things, to me, pale next to the kind of permanent impoverishment of our politics and the establishment of the rule of an autocrat to impose will. And I think when that happens, this was what we thought in 2016. Okay, but he'll have grown-up supervision and he'll be gone, he'll be okay. We're 8 years later, and I think there's a strong chance of changes that cannot very easily anyway. Poland might be a counterexample, but very hard to reverse and restore once the norms, as opposed to the laws that actually do underlie and animate our democracy, are so withered and seen as optional.
Yeah, I don't see Trump as this part of this. And you're certainly right. There is this kind of global trend away from democracy and towards autocracy. We've seen it many times in our history. The United States has never gone along. You talk about the 1930s, right? There was a large popular movement in the world that thought fascism was actually the wave of the future.
Yeah,
we did not go that direction, because I think our system has built-in constraints on what any single political leader can do. I think instead, what in American history are these cycles of renewal, right? Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, and we are still living at the very tail end of the Reagan Revolution. And I think that's why we're seeing this disorder. It's not because we're sliding into autocracy. Our system is genuinely, on both sides, are trying to figure out how to respond to all of the changes because of globalization and the new information economy. Political scientists who write about the Constitution say at the end of a period like this, we're going to have a lot of disorder as we try to figure out what the next stage is going to look like. And Trump is part of that, right? It's not strange that we see the rise of a populist political movement when there's so much economic disorder. And so the question is, what is the system going to look like after this? A lot of the things he says he wants to do, I wouldn't say are necessarily bad things, no matter who the president is. So, for example, he wants to reduce the size of the professional bureaucracy and make it more responsible to the elected leadership of the country. That's going to benefit Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, but it's going to benefit us because we're going to have more of a say in the policies we make. A lot of things Trump wants to do, he can't do by himself. He can say he wants to engage in all these tax cuts, but only Congress can pass them. He's going to have to work with a Congress. If he wants to raise tariffs 100%, he needs Congress to pass a law for that too. So I think our system, yes, you could worry. And actually, this is something the founders were actually much more worried about, would be an individual who would become president and use it for personal gain. I actually think what they didn't plan for were ideological presidents. That's what the system has a hard time containing. But the founders designed our system to contain that. So I don't really worry about Trump becoming president and becoming an autocracy. It hasn't ever happened in our history. If anyone was going to be the autocrat, it was going to be FDR, who'd been elected to 4 terms in the midst of a great emergence, national, foreign, and domestic emergency. Still, our system responded. I don't think Trump poses that kind of a threat.
He has to do it with others, but part of what the history that's going to be written is the incredible sort of obeisance of the Republican Party that has really fallen into line. So it makes it, they're all scared of him. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to get some questions from students. We have a microphone. We can line up over here. Any student questions first?
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Shri, introduce yourself and then.
How's it going? I'm Shri. I'm a junior here at the University of Notre Dame. We met during lunch, but thank you again. This has been a great debate. And my question is, we've heard a lot of talk about how Trump might be a threat to democracy, but do you think that Harris at all is a threat to democracy? Because for the first time in the history of the United States, we have an administration that has launched 91 felony counts against their opponent, tried to imprison their opponent, tried to disqualify their political opponent, leading in the polls in the state of Colorado. The Supreme Court tried to disqualify Trump. We have seen clear evidence that the Biden administration has colluded with social media networks to censor information that they don't want out there, such as on things such as COVID. It seems like the Biden-Harris administration has been engaging in a lot of anti-democratic actions throughout this presidency. So do you worry at all that could be exacerbated with a Harris administration?
Professor Lippman,
Yeah. You've drunk the Kool-Aid, Shri. Look, it's spurious to say
And
that
its color is green, I bet.
it's spurious to say that Harris and Biden, I mean, we were just talking about the very opposite, that they've been hands off to some. And of course, before it was always Biden has done this. Now somehow Harris has jumped to the top of the line. It's just, I think it's just a mistake, an empirical mistake to somehow say they have launched 91 counts against the whole part of this discussion has been whether those are righteous. It's a matter of rule of law, but there's basically no evidence that it's been driven by, ordered by the White House. On the contrary, the evidence is that they've said exactly 0 to DOJ. So in that sense, I would reject the premise.
I actually agree more with your second part of your point, which is if Harris is elected, I think we're going to see not a slide to autocracy. I think what we're living through is a slide towards technocratic government with a lack of democratic participation. And the thing that really strikes me about, it's not really Harris, I think it's Biden. I think it's also Obama. I think the Democratic Party has become the party of progressive government, not progressive in the progressive or regressive, but progressive in the idea. This is Woodrow Wilson's idea. He's a brilliant guy. He said, concentrate all policymaking power in bureaucrats and keep them far away from the control of elected politicians because the politics are dirty. We don't want them to interfere with the judgment of experts. But experts, I think, need democratic accountability. And more and more in our system, I think they don't have it. So the example I really agree with you was the facts that are coming to light now about how the Biden White House tried to get social media companies to suppress free speech by people like Jay Bhattacharya, who's going to be coming in a few months, who said maybe we shouldn't have COVID lockdowns in elementary schools, right? And the White House wanted him deplatformed because of that. I am not comfortable with a government that says your speech is misinformation, that your speech is true. That is the expert mindset. And that, I think, is anti-democratic. And it's easy to slide into that, to just sit back passively and let experts run things. But that, I don't think, is a democratic system. And that's what Harris's administration just promises the more of. It's just a slow decline that we're experiencing.
We bypassed the keeping Trump off the ballot in Colorado, and that kind of was dominated politics for a few weeks and then just went away. Is it good that it went away?
Yeah. It's funny. I recently had a friendly conversation with Judge Ludig, who a conservative paragon and thought it's an abomination. But I'll just say this, from the time it came up, it just seemed clear to me that almost beyond the law, they're not going to do it. You can't do it. It's probably good that they didn't do it. Some of you read the text of Section 3 and you put it against what Trump did, and then you think about how can it be executed. It's a lot of things if you're doing it based on the law only. But I was neither surprised nor saddened that it came out as it did.
One point, and Harry made this point, and I agree with him with this, is that we should always think, in law it teaches you to think this, reverse the political polarity of everything if you want to test whether you actually agree this would be a good idea. And one thing that does worry me about this lawfare campaign against Trump is that Harry and his, I was going to say fellow travelers, the fish you all swim together in the same.
We used to be the cool ones
Yeah.
now.
But
yeah.
but you say these extraordinary measures we're taking are justified because Trump is a unique threat to democracy.
What extraordinary measures?
Prosecuting a former president.
Okay.
I've done
Now
that
we're back to
before.
question one.
No, but it's one of a series of things like this disqualification effort, right? That was the first time that ever happened, disqualifying a presidential candidate.
It's the first time that a president ever did that.
But the thing is that these are not going to be one-time only affairs. Once you cross the Rubicon, the other side will get to do it too. So one reason I think it was good that the court in the Colorado case said you can't use the 14th Amendment to knock out Trump was if it did knock out Trump, who do you think was going to do it next?
All right. But the rule of law answer would be the next time a president or anyone swears an oath to the Constitution and engages in an insurrection, they should go too. That would be the rule of law.
No. But I'm saying is that it's also a tool. It becomes a tool of political warfare beyond elections, or becomes part of our elections and becomes an accepted feature of elections. So just like you said, if the DA in New York City can go after Trump for this, then a DA in Texas can go after Kamala, can go after Hunter or Joe Biden. That's true. The same thing is true, I think, of this. If Trump had been knocked off the ballot, then you would have seen other states try to knock Democratic candidates off the ballot under the same exact theory. I think it's just
without
better.
The facts, yeah.
Doesn't matter what the facts are for these peripheral purposes. They're just going to use it as a tool because...
Fair enough. We have other...
Just to be clear, if you have a question, come line up along this column here. But here.
Thank you to both of you for your comments. I think Professor Munoz will like this question. We'll see. But given things we both said, and FDR came up, and do you think there's actually bad incentives that are created by limiting presidential terms to 2 terms? And do you see examples of that in American history? Or are you worried? It sounds like you're somewhat worried about this with if Trump is reelected now. What sort of bad incentives does limiting presidential terms create?
Okay, just if anyone didn't hear, the 2-term limit. I just taught Federalist 72 in class this week. I said in class, maybe you'd agree, maybe not. In 2016, the leading Democratic candidate would have been Barack Obama. 2024, the leading Democratic candidate would be Barack Obama. But he's not eligible. Is that
And Trump, this is the only time Republicans have ever nominated the same person 3 straight terms in our history. So this is, Sorry, what, you want to start? Or?
She moved. Oh, there you are. You're a moving target. I actually think Alexander Hamilton is right about this. I think he was generally right on most things he wrote about the executive. And that's because I'm writing a book about Alexander Hamilton and the Constitution. But on this
like
one,
a musical.
Yeah. Actually, the next musical should be Madison. The musical. Be like all short people. Of which I would be one. Yeah. Hamilton says, he raises this interesting question, which is, and it's the one we're fundamentally talking about, which is how do you constrain a president who you're worried has bad motives? And so you have impeachment. Hamilton says you do have prosecution after they leave office. But he actually says in the Federalist Paper, the most important restraint on a president is his reputation, what he called fame, right? But which we would think of as reputation. And he said he had a good view of fame. He was anticipating the Kardashians, but he was saying, like, he said something like fame is the leading goal of noble minds. He thought people would go into politics not because they want to be famous like celebrity famous, they would be on fame in terms of historical respect. And so he said, if you ever have a term limit, what happens he said, what would happen to a president in your lame duck term when you never have to go back to the people for approval of what you had done? And even if you decided not to run again, you still care what the electorate would say about you. And so Hamilton said a term limit would actually be a terrible idea for presidents. I actually think he's been borne out. And it's not just Obama who, like Reagan would have won a third term, Clinton probably would have won a third term, Eisenhower, if we hadn't had 2-term limit.
So there's obviously situations where the best thing for the country would have been a third term, but I think the principle, it wasn't constitutional at the time, comes from Washington, who obviously would have won a third term, stepping aside. And I think we rightfully revere that choice as being a real concomitant of democratic values and not having a king, and tempered, this is, again, we're back in Plato, but tempered ambitions. Yes, there are times where the best president, all things considered, would be the one who's served 2 terms. But I think that it's such a strong cultural norm that it's become a constitutional norm. By and large, on balance, is a good thing for our vision of our leaders.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here and for your very interesting discussion. I was curious about the example of other countries which have had populist movements and experienced democratic backsliding in ways which seem to parallel what's happening in the United States. However, these countries don't have democratic tradition and established history as long as the United States has. So I was wondering about our history. Does that serve to cement these norms and make us more able to trust that these democratic values will be continued to be preserved by future generations? Or does it risk lulling us into a false sense of security and preventing us from acknowledging the significant changes in culture and the ways in which our modern society, technology have affected democracy?
Great question. And I agree with your implicit view, except cement. I think it serves to bolster, to harden, to make it tougher. But we too, all these democracies we revere have had checkered histories, right? France, Germany, and we've been uniquely successful. And it's this grand American success story.
One of the things some of these other countries do, which if you look at, you were saying empirically, if you look at it, has not been a good idea, has been using prosecution against former heads of state. Brazil, South Korea, where I came from, I think every South Korean president has been in jail now. In Brazil, you're seeing the prosecution of Bolsonaro by the current administration. The current president himself had been in jail before for corruption. So I think when you look at what that does, that introduces instability into the government by using this kind of, so you could just look and decide, is this something we want to have in our system? So I don't think it's a healthy track record. In terms of the larger question about democratic backsliding, that is much the discussion in political science, I take it these days. I still think the United States is a very different country than Europe. You do see it happening in Europe. Harry mentioned Hungary or Poland. There are other countries in Western Europe which have democratic constitutions, and all this that's happening there, I don't think has happened here. And I don't think it will happen here. I still think America is an exceptional country. And we have these features in our system, like federalism, like strong states, like private civil society, which tamp down politics and contain the ability of any kind of autocratic movement. Compared to Europe, we have such a decentralized country where political institutions are local and community-based. I don't really see an autocracy succeeding here.
Circling back to Harris being put in Biden's place mid-election cycle, is the Democratic Party's selection of Harris reminiscent of the original conception of the Electoral College? That being like a group of trusted or knowledgeable electors choosing, in this case, the candidate, not necessarily the president, but choosing someone to go forward. Is it Hamiltonian in a sense? Is it a bad thing, or is this not like that at all?
When I was describing it as being anti-democratic, I wasn't saying that I didn't like it. Or right, like because I was actually praising the anti-democratic parts of our Constitution as being a stabilizing force on our politics. I haven't decided yet whether I like this kind of opening up of the political parties, or I feel I detect in Harry a desire for political parties to be more organized and play a greater directional role in politics like they used to before the 70s. Even through the 60s, you didn't have primaries in every state. Right? The primary was still unusual in the 1960 election. So I'm not sure yet whether I still like the idea of wide open primaries or whether having political parties choose the elected leaders would be. I think that if you have the system you're talking about, you'll have a lot of people with great CVs become president. I actually wrote a book arguing that great CVs and presidential success are inversely. Great presidents tend to have not been the people who had been Secretary of State and governor. And in fact, the most qualified people to be president generally tend to be our worst presidents, like James Buchanan.
All right, two questions from me. First one, you don't have to answer, but I hope you will. Who's going to win?
Harry, we're both originally from Pennsylvania.
Yeah. It's funny. I had a podcast recently that ended with a political pundit, Mullah John Fast, saying Pennsylvania. Look, I do think that, I don't know, but I think that I've been persuaded by people who I think are fairly wise about this stuff, that it turns on such, almost not even states, but microcosms or communities in states that are as mercurial as the weather. It's interesting to me that Trump is playing, he lost. He needs 7 million more votes, but he's not trying to enlarge. He has a strategy that I think is about finding more voters out of the woodwork, maybe because they fear and loathe Harris. But it seems to me to turn, I think in some objective way, she's got a slight edge now. And she has successfully adopted the mantle of the candidate of change. And one thinks in the last couple weeks of things trending that way, but it's all so infinitesimal in its forces and stuff. If it rains in North Carolina or Helene or whatever, it could be pivotal. So I feel it'd be foolhardy to hazard a guess. I like guessing. Beats me.
So Yogi Berra has a great comment on this. For the students, Yogi Berra was not a cartoon figure. He was actually a real player for the Yankees, right? And then he was coach of the Mets, I think. And he is just full of common sense aphorisms. Like
Yogiisms, there's a term in English.
It's like he said, if you come to a fork in the road, take the fork. So he said predictions are really hard, especially about the future.
Yeah.
But I just spent the last week in Pennsylvania, which is interesting to see campaign ads. I hadn't seen any in many years.
Relentless.
And I thought Hillary was going to win in 2016, and I thought Trump was going to win in 2020. In Pennsylvania, I felt like things were trending Trump's way, actually, that Harris had this kind of honeymoon. And I think people were relieved Biden wasn't going to run again. He got a big boost. But I feel like it crested a little early for her. And I think Trump's making a comeback. I just felt that just hanging around in Pennsylvania for a week. So if I had to guess, I would say Trump.
Could you just share one story about your former bosses, about Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas?
I'll have to cast my memory back more, so you better go first.
Thomas keeps coming to Notre Dame. You probably guys have more stories about him than I do now. I think he's been there, 3 times to speak? Always with Phil, actually. I don't know why. He speaks more to Phil than to me anymore. Justice Thomas used to, until the death threats, travel all around the country without any security or and people. I once went with him on a car ride from Florida to Washington, and we stopped at Steak and Shake, they're called, I think. We stopped somewhere. And I think, and so someone came up to us, we were eating there. I said, you're somebody, I know who you are. And Justice was like, and I think the guy thought he was Billy D. Williams, which I'm sure the Justice wished he looked like more than himself. So that would always happen throughout the whole trip, because they'd seen him on TV, vaguely knew who he was, but they couldn't quite place him, which was exactly the way he liked it. Yeah.
But I'll go with a very similar one, because Marshall was in the elevator coming up to Chambers, and a gentleman got on and called him boy and asked him to take him to the second floor. There's still elevator operators and Marshall went into an immediate down home, almost slave patter. And Ronald, yes sir. And the guy was a lawyer, and they came out on the bench and gave him a link, and it was like,
That's amazing.
yeah. So
I assume he lost the case.
yeah, as Justice Scalia said, there are so many people who have the unfortunate tendency of pronouncing his name Scalia, and that has led to the loss of more than one case. And
We have a conviction here at the center in our classes and in our events that getting very smart people from different perspectives leads to a richer conversation. And I think that was definitely shown today. So thank you.